And recording has started. All right. Well, welcome, welcome. Hi, everybody. Hi, Dr. Robin Buckley. Thank you so much for being with us here. So
I'm so excited, Lauren. This will be a great conversation.
I know I'm so excited. So as you know, my two passions in this world, besides my family and my dog, are writing and mental health. And this month, I really decided to combine those two for our Lauren Pernicom's series on writing for mental health. So the last few weeks we've talked about how if you are a mental health advocate, how you can tell your story. We then talked about how companies can tell their mental health story and why it's so important. Now, today, I would love to talk with you about kind of understanding the clinical speak and the like communicating it correctly. Now, this is something very important to me as the daughter of a clinical social worker. And in this world, this very interconnected world that we have, people are really beginning to understand more about the world of psychology, the world of your brain. And they are starting to use these terms that you and my mom would dub clinical terms. And probably I think in one right, it's great that people are getting interested in this, coming from growing up in a world where no one talked about it and I felt very isolated. I love the fact that our, teens today are utilizing the internet for good, but I also know that you can't just, throw the word trauma into every sentence and have it be okay. I think there are a lot of ramifications,
Mm.
and it's particularly meaningful to me as a person that writes about a lot of clinical things. Our business mainly focuses on biotech, healthcare, pharma. So I understand those kind of ramifications of using the terms incorrectly. But I do wonder if the rest of the world is not as tuned in as some of us in the know. So I would love to hear from you. First of all, tell us who you are and what you do, and then give us your thoughts on this kind of new revolution of using clinical terms on TikTok.
Right. Absolutely. So my background is clinical psychology, and for a long time at the beginning of my career, I did traditional mental health. And over the past 20 years, I've really shifted to focusing on coaching. So I do a lot of work with entrepreneurs and executive level business people around their own mental wellness and working to help them. And my catchphrase is making their brain their ally instead of their adversary. So helping them understand the neuroscience behind success and optimal performance, and truly applying cognitive behavioral strategies so that they really achieve the success they want. So it's taking all of the really wonderful positive psychology aspects and the data-driven cognitive behavioral strategies and applying it in a proactive and often preventative way. So I love
Yeah, I
that
love that.
about the shift from mental health to coaching. As for your question, it's a great question, Lauren, because I'm like you. I love that mental health topics are now part of mainstream conversations. I love watching younger millennials and Gen Z just be candid and open when they're struggling, when they have certain diagnoses. My hesitation is always to remind them that that's not their identity.
Right.
And that is only part of their experience, but not part of who they are. And that's a
Yeah.
big delineation to me, that they don't take on, or them or anybody take on this persona of, oh, my OCD, or my ADHD. That, no,
Yeah.
it's not yours. It's just part of
Right.
your experience. So it's, I have ADHD. I'm not ADHD, and fill in the blank. And you're right, throwing around terms, and I love that you referenced your mom. When people are like, oh, it's my OCD, and I want to ask them, which is inappropriate, do you actually have OCD, or are you
I
just
know.
throwing that term around? Because in my world, that's a very specific and very debilitating diagnosis. So that's not something
Right.
to lightly throw out there. It's understanding that when we talk about trauma, when we talk about triggers, those aren't light words in my world, in your mom's world, and in mental health. Those are very specific. And that, yeah, you can have hard things in your life, but it might not be at the level of trauma. And how do we define trauma? And again, trauma is not who you are. It's something, if it actually is by definition a trauma or just a hardship, it's something you're going through or have gone through, but it doesn't have to be your identity.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've personally learned over the last, few years of diving into this world is, there's big T and little t, and
Right.
it's fine to have little t traumas, like bullying when you were a kid can really
Mhm.
impact you, and challenges with your parents can be little t, but it still doesn't mean that it's an okay word to just kind of throw around, as you're having a drink with your friends or posting on, online. It's still very much a clinical term. So I
Yeah.
think that that's, my concern is these people, really taking these terms out of context. And my concern is that when we take them out of context, now we've kind of gone in the polar opposite direction where, when I was growing up, no one talked about it. Now people are throwing it around way too casually. So
Right.
that feels like a whole different concern. Do you kind of
Right.
agree on that? Yeah.
I do. I think that people don't always understand that even with a big T trauma, and I love how you delineate that, you can still get past that. You can still, one of my favorite books of all time is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And for those who aren't aware, Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor. And to me, it epitomizes what we're talking about, that you could go through something as traumatic. And I think, Holocaust survivors are at the top, certainly within that list.
Absolutely.
And it's still not define your life or define who you are. I
Yeah.
mean, not detracting from the horrible doesn't even encompass what survivors went through, but so many, like Viktor Frankl, didn't let that be, kind of the platform for the rest of their life. They experienced it. It was horrible. They learned from it. They try and educate others about it, but it didn't become their identity. And I
Right.
admire that. And I think that,
That's huge.
whatever the trauma is, big or little, we can decide, and that's the cognitive behavioral piece of my specialization, we can decide how much of it is going to stay with us forever and at what impact it's going to stay with us forever or not. So I don't judge people in terms of how they experience their big or small traumas, but there is a decision around how long am I going to hold on to it as part of my identity, and at what point do I want it to become part of my experience that I've learned from and grown from. I think
Right.
that's hard, and again, it's hard to have these conversations, so I appreciate you bringing it up, because
Yeah.
so many people say, oh, you're discounting what I went through, and that's not it. It's not
No.
discounting. It's deciding how long it's going to be part of your present and your future when it was in your past, and what pieces of it are you going to use to really grow into yourself.
Yeah, and it's such a good point. And I think that almost, by using these clinical terms that are probably, out of their world, they are almost, going too far. You are, if you are using these clinical terms and you shouldn't be, or not that there's no law, but
Right.
if you are thereby kind of making it more of a personality than, just something that is a challenge that is making you the best version of yourself, instead of really, moving on with it and using it to better you. You're clinging to these terms, and I feel like that's, the concern. And then my bigger concern is then people are getting online and talking about it and telling everybody else. And I think that, to me, is one of the kind of ramifications of using these terms inappropriately, not just personally, but the kind of, crowd aspect. Um, do you see your, like, coaching clients come to you using those terms a little bit more, or have you noticed that kind of shift in your business over the last, like, 5, 10 years or so?
Yeah, especially I do think it is more for younger generations and not, again, no judgment, no blame,
Yeah,
just more because of the exposure on social media. And again,
exactly.
I think with almost everything in life, there's a good and a negative to
Exactly.
everything. So social media has normalized these conversations, has
Yeah.
normalized some of
Great.
these experiences, but at the same time, not everything is, and we focus on trauma, not everything is trauma. So as an example, when I was in grad school, the chair of my department said in a very public setting that he didn't understand why women were getting their higher degrees because all they were going to do is get married, have children, and never use their degrees. Yeah, almost a
Oh
direct
my
quote.
God.
Now, I could definitely define that as a trauma. I would define it as a small t trauma. It certainly could have been something that either demoralized me, made me feel uncomfortable. Well, it did all that. It actually
Yeah,
did.
yeah.
Made me feel uncomfortable, demoralized me, took my breath away, and then I turned it around on myself because I didn't say anything in the moment. I just froze. So I beat myself up for a while after that. But again, I never would have used the term trauma. It sucked and it was
Yeah.
inappropriate. And I do wish at that time I had more confidence. Good Lord, if he said it in front of me now, I'd be like, really? Let's have this conversation.
Yeah.
But I think that we have crossed that line in society where those kind of situations are now defined as trauma, which means somehow it's now a mark on you. For me, again, and not that my experience is perfect, but for my individual situation, I was like, oh, yeah. Okay, now I'm going to prove to you.
Watch.
And
Yeah.
then
Watch me.
eventually over time, I stopped proving it to him. And I just said, and I want to keep doing the things I do because I
Yeah.
am smart and I am capable. And I chose to have children and get married and have a career because you can do all those
Yeah.
things. Maybe not all at
Yeah.
once, but, divided into percentages and all that. But, um, it does scare me when I hear the word trauma thrown out. And with my clients, I very quickly have them define, well, what does trauma mean? What does that look like to you? What does that mean
Oh
in your
God. Yeah.
world? So we can really make sure that when they use that term, it's based on a clinical definition. And if they're using it inappropriately, then I get to educate them and say, couldn't that, have been a challenge or a hardship or, something to overcome rather than a trauma, which has a
Yeah.
lot of weight in the mental health industry.
That is so interesting. And I encourage everybody listening to really think about it the same way with OCD or bipolar or depression. When you say, oh, I'm super depressed. Are you actually clinically depressed or are you just,
Right.
having a bad day? And those definitions, when you do use those definitions incorrectly, I think it does diminish the people that are living with chronic depression. And it changes the meaning of the word. Depression doesn't, to say you're depressed doesn't equal having a bad day or you're feeling sad. So I think
And then
that's,
doesn't it, and I wonder if it also doesn't make whatever so if you're not technically or define, according to clinical definitions as, we'll use depression since you brought that up, Lauren, does it make your experience harder because now you've put it into a category and you've
that's true.
told your brain, oh, I'm depressed, or
Yep.
I always have anxiety. Well, is it clinical anxiety or are you always worrying and ruminating, which of course can transfer into clinical anxiety, but don't we want to head that off first? And if you're not dealing with clinical anxiety, if you're telling your brain, yeah, for the past 3 months, I've just been worried all the time. When you say it like that, that's something that you're like, okay, this is manageable. But when you're like, oh, I have clinical anxiety, that's a bigger
That's a
issue.
big
Not that it
thing.
cannot be insurmountable, but it's one of those, are you telling your brain it's something that's big and bigger than you're ready to deal with? Or are you telling your brain, okay, yeah, the past couple months have been hard or difficult or have kind of lowered my mood, but that's a different experience than clinical depression. So, a lot of what I do with clients is talking about how they tell their brain things, because our
Yeah.
brains are lazy. They'll believe anything we tell them and follow through with it and find evidence of
Yeah.
it. So
Yeah.
I'm always really clear with my clients, be careful what you say to yourself because your brain
Yep.
will believe it and then it'll follow through. And that is not where you want your brain to be functioning.
your brain will believe it, and then will the, tens of thousands of followers that you have on TikTok
Right.
or and that's ultimately, my biggest concern here is like using platforms that I love using LinkedIn to share my knowledge, but I'm also super careful that when I am talking about mental health, anything, I am going to run it by my mom or shout out
Right.
to Dr. Priya Hippolyte, who is a good friend, and I always try to run anything serious by her because I don't want to be that person putting out the wrong
Right.
information.
And just because you're experiencing a situation doesn't mean you're an expert on it. Sometimes I cringe because in my
Exactly.
industry of coaching,
Oof.
people are like, "Oh, I went through this, so now I coach people in this." And I'm like, "That
Yeah.
no, that your anecdotal, individual experience doesn't make you an expert, doesn't make you trained and educated in this." So I appreciate that you go to the people who have training and are educated to verify what you're going to share, even if you're using your own experience as examples, because I do think that when I see things pop up on TikTok, that it's, I get that, like, okay, but what are your credentials? What are, okay, that's your experience, but your experience is a siloed individual experience. And there might be commonalities that you share with other people, but there's no way your experience is identical. Whereas, in the clinical world, if we look at the criteria for any psychological disorder, those are very clearly laid out, um, variables that we take into account when we're going for a diagnosis to support someone's health. So yeah, it always, I'm like, oh, wait a minute,
I know.
what's your
I,
background?
I know. I always look for that. So in a lot of the people here watching are also kind of entrepreneurs like me, and small business owners or people representing companies. How can companies or leaders or your executive coaching clients, how do you help them kind of show that their company, their business is mental health friendly without using the incorrect terms or being accidentally offensive? Um, because I think that's one thing that as an executive or business owner, you want to show these days that you are mental health inclusive, that you do have the parameters in place to support people that have mental illnesses or are going through those tough times. But I think sometimes people accidentally use the wrong terms or are kind of missing the mark. How do you coach people into not doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something I do. I spend a lot of my days doing. So the first step, and it's the most uncomfortable for a lot of people, is to be transparent and authentic. So it is imperative that leaders make the choice to share their stories. And that's hard. And it's hard to tell someone, especially someone who's trained more in a traditional leadership style, which is stoic and distant and objective and all that. Okay, now you need to open the most personal part of your life and share that. But it is important because it again creates that culture of we're not going to hide this. If
Right.
if someone got diagnosed with cancer or diabetes at work, there'd be accommodations, there'd be support in place. And yet mental health is seen as different, and it's not. I mean, to the point where so many of the mental health disorders are biological. Like there's changes in
Yeah.
brain chemistry, there's changes in brain structure. So they're as biological as any physical diagnosis, traditional
Yeah.
physical diagnosis. So when I talk to leaders, it's about, okay, find your story. And I actually do a
I like
whole
that.
talk, a workshop where I help leaders identify their story, craft it, practice it so they can share it in a genuine way and in a way that
I
makes
love
them
that.
comfortable. So whether it's, at the extreme end, I had a client whose son was dealing with severe clinical depression and attempted suicide. And he really didn't want to share that story. He was like, Robin, that's too much. And I'm like, okay. And you don't have to. We can pick a different story, but I'm telling you the power of that story, especially since he and his wife worked so hard to get his son to a healthy place.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
really important, and it has a good outcome. So it's good for people to know you're not,
Alone.
immune to it, Right.
Mm.
So that's the first step. And maybe you don't pick, again, I never encourage someone to pick something that they really, really are resistant to sharing.
Yeah,
But we
yeah.
all have examples, and it doesn't have to be at the severe clinical range. I mean, whether people have been through a divorce or dealt with some addiction level, or a parent who went through dementia or Alzheimer's, like we
Yeah.
all have stories. And I would even hazard a guess, it's not that you have to pick it from someone you know, like you've been through stuff as a
Yeah.
leader. So share that and be part of that. And then second, admit to being human, that
Yeah.
when, when leaders have these conversations, whether it's one-on-one with people or in front of large groups of their workforce, admit that you're not always aware of terminology and how terminology changes, which seems to be
Yes.
often at
Yes.
best. Whether it's about mental health, whether it's about LGBTQ issues, whether it's about women's issues, whatever it is, admit to saying, hey, I might not always get it right. So call me out. Let me know when I've used a word that is uncomfortable for you. Let me know if I've gotten something wrong. Like encourage that bi-directional communication that is so important. And I'll give you an example around DEI. My sister just went through a DEA training in her school district. She's a director and has to keep up, obviously, because she needs to be the role model. So she, in a conversation, she's like, I said something about, oh, yeah, yesterday was a cakewalk. She's like, oh, you can't say that anymore. I'm like, what? What do you mean? And she explained the history of where that term came from, which is tied to slavery and is horrific. And please, oh yeah, it's
Oh my gosh.
one of those like inane word, phrases we use all the time without knowing, not even thinking about it. Like, how would I
Yeah.
even know? So she explained the history, and it's horrible. And like one of those things that anytime I say it now, I'm gonna pull it back or I'm gonna not use it at all. But I think it's important, because how else do we learn unless we encourage people to say, ooh, yeah, we know more about that now, so we're gonna, refrain from that. That's
Yeah.
how we learn as leaders and as entrepreneurs. And sometimes the only way we're going to learn is from the people around us.
Oh, I know, and I'm so glad you brought that example up, because last week when we were talking to Tara Bodine, who's a HR consultant, she was saying something similar about tribal knowledge. It's
Right.
just something that we always say. Like, all right, we need the tribal knowledge. So I think what I'm really hearing from across the board from all of you guys is that it's a lot of these things are just ingrained in our society, and
Mhm.
it's not going to change overnight, but
Right.
slowly but surely we can remove the language that is inappropriate and misguided, and incorporate language that better represents who we are today as a culture and is not inappropriately used. So it's interesting, and even as somebody that is super into this stuff, I don't even there's things that I'm sure I'm saying that I don't even realize.
Right.
So
And how best, for a leader to demonstrate that their humanity by saying, I'm going to make mistakes and I'm relying on you, the workforce or whoever
yeah.
to teach me in those moments. Cause I want to grow, ideally that's in my world, the best part about leadership is that you can help others grow. But again, that traditional model of leadership is that left out the leader because the leader somehow was done growing. And that's ridiculous. That
Yeah,
we
that's a
we
really good
certainly
point.
can learn. I love that about having, children in their 20s now, that when I say things, because it wasn't part of my generation, they're like, "Ooh, mom, can't do that anymore." I'm like, "Okay, thanks, and tell me a little bit more. And where can I find more information? And please don't say TikTok. Like, tell me where I can get
Yes,
more information about
exactly.
that, so I can learn and grow, and it becomes authentic learning rather than you tell me something and then I forget about it in 2 days." Um, so I think there's so much that we can learn from each other, from different generations, whether they're older or younger. That it's just a great opportunity for growth and development,
And
particularly in the area of mental health.
And I love that you gave that example about TikTok. So where would you suggest that somebody go to find validation instead of TikTok? Or you know what, guys, I love LinkedIn more than anybody, but Dr. Robin, tell us where to solidify our our findings on the internet.
Yeah, I honestly think that a great place to start are reliable podcasts. I love podcasts because they're easy in this day and age when I think most of us have a much shorter attention span than some of even the older generations, that they give us the snippets, but it doesn't stop there. That typically in reliable podcasts, they might reference a person or reference a book. Well, go find it. Like, don't limit yourself just to, well, this podcast told me. Make sure, or research the background of the podcaster. Like, are they in mental health, or do they just talk about mental health? Like in this case, Lauren, is it someone that, has consistently afforded the same message, or is their message all over the place? Their guests
That's
are
a
like
good point.
diverse in a way that doesn't even make sense. It's not, encouraging different perspectives. It's like, there's no consistency in the messaging. Again, I'm not for like, it always has to be the same, but some idea of new information. That would be another one, is making sure that the information you're getting isn't from, 2000. That was almost 25 years ago, even though in my world it seems like it was just yesterday. But like, I know when you think about it,
it wasn't. No.
I know when you think about it, it's like you can't be referencing something that was 25 years old. So, my background, when you do any kind of higher education, you are trained to look for the sources. And I do actually think, I actually do believe that the Gen Z and younger millennials were trained in similar ways, but it's really easy to forget that when information is so immediately accessible, and it's hard to take that second step to check the sources. But when I listen to podcasts, and I shouldn't probably admit this, but when I get to a stoplight, I might be quickly sending myself an audio text to, oh yeah, go look up that book, or go look up this person, because then I know whether the information I'm getting from the podcast is reliable. In my world, I look up peer-reviewed sources, but I don't think that's fair to tell people to do, because they're cumbersome and boring very often. But
Yeah.
identify your source that you can get information, and then follow up to really do an investigation through multiple means. Maybe you heard something on a podcast, and then you find it on TikTok, and then you find it in a book or an article. You go the extra mile to collect information from different sources to see how they validate or don't validate each other.
Yeah, and I mean, I am of the same ilk, where I do the peer-reviewed model, just because I do write about a lot of clinical and whatnot. But I would honestly even encourage people, like, so if you're talking about mental health, go to the CDC. They actually have a beautiful website. I have to say, everything is very easy to understand and organized really well. So if you can't find it on the CDC, or your local government, mass.gov has an awesome resource
Mayo
too.
Clinic is also a really good resource, and NIMH, so National Institute of Mental Health.
Yep.
So these are all great, primary sources, in my opinion, where you can get that information. So WebMD was not included in this list, as hopefully your audience picked up, because that is not as reliable. That is like a secondary or tertiary level resource. But the ones that are, the places that are actually doing and generating research on their websites, I think they create snippets of the research that are really digestible for anybody.
Exactly. Yeah.
Good recommendation.
Yeah, because it's just, if you are sharing things from a WebMD or whatnot, there is just no guarantee. And like you said, it is that kind of like tertiary level, because the people that are writing that have probably gone through several levels of resources. And, it's like the game of telephone. And by the time you get to the third person, it's kind of lost its original meaning. So
right. And I don't know about you, Lauren, when I was going through grad school, at the end of grad school, when Wikipedia was first started coming out, and I watched it with my kids too, that it was okay to start with Wikipedia to get like a general sense, but you don't stop there. You go to the next, you look at the references that are underneath and go find some of those primary sources. So yeah, you want a snapshot, go to WebMD, but then follow up. Don't use that as your guiding light, because what's scary, and I'm sure you've heard and seen this, people who diagnose themselves based on WebMD, and I'm like, no, that's not how this works. That's why we have professionals and other resources. So
And put down Google, everybody. Put down Google. If you're struggling, reach out to your primary care.
Mhm.
Um, this was a lovely chat and a great way to end, encouraging people to do their research, which is always my MO in this world as a writer. So, um, any final words of encouragement? Tell everybody where they can find you and how they can work with you and anything else.
Absolutely. So you can find me on Instagram. So just Dr. Robin Buckley, all one word. A lot of times I pick themes for the month. So this month, for example, we're talking a lot about how to manage change and transition and applying cognitive behavioral strategies to that. You can also find me on my website, which is Insights Group South, igsouth.com. And I am always happy to be a resource. I really do think that in the mental health industry, whether it's through traditional mental health or coaching, providing education, just as you're doing, Lauren, is one of our main functions. And so when I can provide some information for people, even if they're not clients, that's a big piece of kind of my value system. But remembering that mental health is something that is achievable. Mental wellness is something that I wish people looked at the same as physical health. So if you have your dentist on your calendar twice a year, if you have for women, a gynecologist on your calendar once a year, and your GP, depending on your age, one every year to 5 years, ideally you'll have someone who's also helping you evaluate your mental wellness at least once a year, just as a check-in. Because I think once society starts seeing it as equitable to physical health, then that's where we've really reached an idealized place.
Yeah, and that is something that I am here to shout to from the rooftops is that, your mental health is just as important as your physical health.
Agreed.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. This was so helpful and definitely a topic that is so near and dear to my heart, coming from all my different worlds. So thank you so much, and have a lovely weekend, everybody. We will catch you next time where we are wrapping up our mental health month with an advocate who has turned mental health into a cookbook. I'm so super excited. It sounds so crazy, but it's amazing. I'm so excited for you guys to meet her. And thanks, guys.